2 Corinthians 2:14 is, I think, a really great example.
Yeah, let's talk about that
because,
one.
Yeah, because in my opinion, this is the one passage in the New Testament, or not in the New Testament, sorry, in Paul, where the Roman emperor is evoked in the clearest way.
And yes. Let me just read it real quick for our listeners. So we have, and thanks be to God, the one who is always at all times, and I'll let you tell us how we should translate thriambuo, right? He's always thriambuing us in the Messiah. Yeah. So that's the line, right? And that word is, it's a technical term for participating in the triumph, which I'll let you explain. And the us is the direct object of the actor who is triumphing. So it brings into the conversation a very Roman ritual at the time. It's taken over by the Romans. We know who got to triumph in this time period. And as you chronicle in your book, there's actually probably a particular triumph even that Paul is of Claudius, which is, as you show in the sources, kind of problematic, sort of like, maybe having the party was maybe a little too big for what was being celebrated, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
So go ahead and take us through that. So how should we understand what's happening here? What's the background of triumphing and all that?
First of all, what's the translation that you used? What do they say for the version that you used? What do they say?
Sorry, I am using my Greek New Testament.
So you did. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I didn't.
I thought about. Okay. Because many translations say something like, "Thanks be to God who always causes us to triumph," or something like
right.
That.
And then that leads for English readers were like, "Oh, great! God makes us winners," or something like that.
Exactly. You will be sick of winning, like Donald Trump style victories.
So sick of winning. Follow Jesus.
I mean, that's the effective history of the text, basically. There's this victory of all kinds, and even military victories are associated with this. And then sometimes it says like God will give us triumph. So, and you think, well, what's the triumph? Is it victory? There's some, I think some versions say God leads us in triumph.
Triumphal procession or something like that, which also sounds great. I want to be in that triumphal procession until I think about the car.
Right. So if you look at the Greek verb in the ancient sources, it actually becomes quite clear what it means. So what it means in other cases, it always means that the party that is referred to as the direct object is the party that is the defeated party, like captives that are presented to the watching crowd in Rome. In the triumphal procession, and that's important too. We sometimes speak about triumphal processions today in a metaphorical way, like, I don't know, the Super Bowl, what's it called? I once was told it's kind of parade like in the US, right? So but in antiquity there was only one triumphus. There was only one triumphal procession, the one in Rome, and it was always celebrated in Rome. And in the sources you can find 2 or 3 exceptions. But mostly these exceptions, it's actually not historical, but it's propaganda by the enemy who says, well, look, this guy did the triumphal procession in Alexandria. Like, he can't be a good Roman. He only do this in Rome.
Right.
So these exceptions actually prove the rule that you do a Roman triumphal procession is something that has to take place in Rome, and it's the ritual that a Roman general is gifted from the Senate after a really important military victory. And of course, part of the celebration is presenting captives, mostly captives that are impressive, like generals from the other side, as part of your triumphal procession. But there are also tons of gold, and some of these processions could take several days. And at the end of this, sometimes the captives were executed, sometimes not. I think people have made too much of this execution aspect, like that being the thing that Paul has in mind here. Like I'm
dead to the
death.
World.
I'm led to death and all my suffering, some things like that. I think that goes too far. But it's definitely right that Paul paints himself, and I think his co-workers, as the ones who are working in this rather shameful role in the Roman triumphal procession. And I think he does this primarily not to attack Caesar or to critique Rome. I think he does this in order to challenge the Corinthians.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Corinthians have a problem with him. They don't like the way he travels around, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have this in the first chapter already in verse 17. He has to respond to this perception of his chaotic travel movements, that he says, I will come, and then he doesn't come.
Mm-hmm.
And now in the second chapter, he talks again about having this opportunity to evangelize. And then he's so worried about the Corinthians that he leaves this town where he's so successful for the gospel, and just wants to meet Titus in order to learn what's going on in Corinth and whether they repent or not.
Mm-hmm.
So and at this point where I think Paul realizes, oh, wait a minute, I'm talking about chaotic travel movements again, and this is not something that's sitting well with the Corinthians. He uses this metaphor, and he says, thanks be to God who leads us as captives in his triumphal procession, and shows us to the world. And I think the metaphor functions in a way to critique the Corinthians by first, on the one hand, accepting their perception of him, like presenting them as the watching crowd in Rome that looks at him and sees this shameful figure. But at the same time, he tries to transform the perception by saying, well, but ultimately, I bring glory to God. Mm-hmm. And if you've got a problem with me and my travel movements, well, you've got a problem with the triumphator, right? The one guy I'm thanking for all this. So I think that's the main thing that he has in mind. But still, I think it's unimaginable that Paul would not have been aware of the fact that this was a very specific Roman term. It's only used here in the New Testament and in Colossians 2:15. It's always used for the Roman triumphal procession in Rome, or if not, that's the exception that proves the rule. And the interesting thing is that in the first century, it was the Roman emperor who was celebrating these triumphal processions, so other generals couldn't or didn't. And interestingly, the only triumphal procession that took place during Paul's lifetime, the other one occurring after the siege of Jerusalem,
right,
when he was already dead, some years earlier. His execution took place some years earlier. So the only triumphal procession that took place during his life was the triumphal procession in 44 CE, the triumphal procession of Claudius. And it's so fascinating that the secondary literature does not talk about this event at all. So we pretend all the time that the triumphal procession is something that is known throughout the empire, and people just talk about it on a regular basis. But actually, the one mega event took place is just never considered, with one exception that I could find in a commentary. It's interesting because it had just happened a couple of years before that, and then in Corinth we even know, and that's quite remarkable, that there was a cult for this British victory that was celebrated every year with, from what we can guess from other cults of the same type, sacrifices for the emperor. So it's quite unique that we know in Corinth, where Paul is writing this letter, people were aware of this event, being reminded of it on a yearly basis.
So the audience to whom he's writing this event has a cult celebrating this particular event of the one triumph by a Roman emperor in Paul's life.
And again, that's not used in the secondary literature in 99% of the time. And then again, on the other side, the writer, we know that from Acts 18, he met Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth. Where were they coming from? From Rome. So he even met potential eyewitnesses of the ceremony. So we have a documented case of contact to potential eyewitnesses. And why did they leave Rome? Because
they were
of the
expelled.
Emperor Claudius. So because of his edict. So I think it's quite natural to expect that they talked about the emperor, especially since I think an argument can be made that Paul had initially wanted to go to Rome from Corinth. But even if not, I mean, it makes sense that they would have talked about this. And I think that's a unique situation, that we have this kind of archaeological circumstantial evidence And so I think it's at least worth exploring whether Paul might kind of contribute something to the discourse surrounding this triumphal procession. And then if you look at how Claudius himself presented this triumphal procession, it becomes even better, because Claudius used it as part of his propaganda to emphasize the global dimension of his empire. So we have one ancient song that is handed down to us in one manuscript that might have been part of a Roman triumphal procession, and that's probably from this triumphal procession. There has been some debate about precise context, but I believe it might have been at least composed in the context of this triumphal procession of Claudius. And it talks about Claudius, who put the ocean that was the former border of the empire into the center of the empire.
Yeah.
Hyperbolically, of course.
Right.
And Claudius himself too, in a speech to the Senate that is recorded in several sources, emphasizes this global dimension. And then, of course, Paul is making exactly the same point about himself and his co-workers. He says, everywhere the gospel is proclaimed through us. And there are several of these cases where I think, well, there are resonances between what Claudius did and what Paul does. Just that in Claudius' case, it just didn't look that well in reality. So, for example, Paul is the captive that brings glory to God. But apparently Claudius had problems finding good captives in Great Britain, in Britannia, mostly because he was there only for 16 days.
Right.
And most people in antiquity understood that this was just a military campaign, a special operation, in order to get this honor in Rome. And that he wasn't really successful in getting good captives over there. And in 51, so several years later, he finally got a good chieftain, Caradacus, who was handed to him betrayed by somebody else. And then when he got him, he paraded him around in Rome again, as if this were the completion of the triumphal procession, as one ancient source says. So obviously that was an issue for Claudius, and Paul just puts his finger right on this issue. And interestingly, he does this probably in 55 CE, so 1 year after the death of Claudius. 1 year after Claudius was presumably poisoned by Nero. So my thinking is that perhaps Paul is using this rather relaxed public discourse on the former emperor to make this joke about Claudius.
Interesting.
Because he knows that in this new climate you can get away with that.
Right.
So we have Seneca writing the Apokolokitos, is the pumpkinification of Claudius, a horrible satire about Claudius, and he too makes fun of Claudius' campaign in Britain.
Yeah. So you make fun of the emperor after that emperor is gone.
Right. So that's another case of of why I think these categories of hidden and public transcript, they are helpful. But they are helpful in drawing our attention to the dynamical borders between them. Like something that could be acceptable one day could not be acceptable another day. Something that might be acceptable in Corinth might not be acceptable in Rome. And sometimes you just make miscalculations and you say things that turn out not to be acceptable in a specific context, as we all do.
Right. That's really interesting. Yeah, very, very interesting. So, that's one that had kind of just been lying in plain sight. I think that was one of the arguments of your book, that this one's not really that hidden. It's kind of there for the taking, and just we hadn't really thought about it.
Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.